Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she adjusted the communications equipment in the sweltering Afghan heat. The forward operating base buzzed with its usual activity, but to most of the soldiers she was invisible. Just another contractor in civilian clothes, fixing their radios and maintaining their technology. They saw her khaki pants and polo shirt, not the Purple Heart hidden in her apartment back in Texas. The Marines called her Tech Lady when they bothered to acknowledge her at all. She had been working at Forward Operating Base Chapman for 8 months now, arriving every morning at 600 to check the communication systems that kept the base connected to the outside world. Her supervisor, a gruff sergeant named Rodriguez, barely spoke to her beyond giving daily assignments. The younger soldiers sometimes made jokes about the quiet woman who spent her days hunched over circuit boards and satellite dishes. What they didn't know was that Maria had served 3 tours in Iraq as a combat engineer before an IED explosion shattered her left leg and ended her military career. The doctors said she was lucky to walk again, but Maria felt anything but lucky as she watched her brothers and sisters in arms deploy while she learned to use civilian technology skills to make a living. The contractor job at Chapman was supposed to be a way back into the world she understood. Even if she couldn't carry a rifle anymore, she kept to herself, eating meals alone and spending evenings in her small quarters reading technical manuals. The other contractors thought she was antisocial, but Maria was actually studying. Every spare moment she memorized the base layout, learned the patrol schedules, and observed the defensive positions. Old habits from her combat days refused to die, even though everyone around her saw only a mild-mannered technician who kept their internet running. The base commander, Colonel Williams, had spoken to her exactly 3 times in 8 months, and each conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. To him, she was a line item on a budget report, a necessary expense to keep his equipment functioning. He had no idea that the woman who silently repaired his communication systems had once defused roadside bombs under enemy fire and earned a Bronze Star for valor. Maria's daily routine never varied. She arrived before dawn, checked the overnight system logs, and began her rounds of equipment maintenance. The communication tower on the eastern perimeter required daily attention due to the harsh desert conditions. The satellite uplinks needed constant calibration. The radio equipment in the command post demanded regular updates and repairs. She moved through these tasks with quiet efficiency, invisible to the soldiers who depended on her work. The isolation didn't bother her anymore. After months of rehabilitation and physical therapy, she had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Her limp was barely noticeable now, but the emotional scars ran deeper. Every night she dreamed of the explosion that ended her military career, waking in cold sweats that she never mentioned to anyone. The contractor job was supposed to be healing, a way to serve again without the physical demands of combat arms. But Maria carried secrets that went beyond her military record. During her recovery, she had spent 2 years training with private security firms, learning skills that went far beyond basic electronics repair. She could field strip an M4 rifle blindfolded, plan defensive positions, and coordinate tactical communications under pressure. The soft-spoken contractor who fixed their computers could also put 3 rounds in a target at 300 yards. Her quarters were Spartan but organized with military precision. A small American flag sat on her desk next to technical manuals and circuit diagrams. Hidden in a locked footlocker were items that would surprise anyone who discovered them. Advanced first aid supplies, tactical gear, and detailed maps of the surrounding terrain that she had drawn herself during her off-duty hours. Maria Santos might have been just a contractor to everyone at Chapman, but she remained a soldier in her heart. The other contractors occasionally invited her to poker games or movie nights, but she always declined politely. They assumed she was simply shy or perhaps dealing with personal problems back home. None of them suspected that she spent those evenings on the base perimeter, timing guard rotations and identifying potential weak points in their defenses. To Maria, Chapman wasn't just her workplace. It was a position that needed defending, and she couldn't turn off the tactical mindset that had kept her alive during 3 combat deployments. The morning of October 15th started like any other for Maria. She arrived at the communications center before sunrise, her steel-toe boots crunching softly on the gravel paths between buildings. The base was quiet except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the guard towers. She unlocked the equipment room and began her routine diagnostics, unaware that intelligence reports were already painting a troubling picture in the command center. Colonel Williams had received disturbing news during his morning briefing. Intercepted communications suggested increased militant activity in the region, but the specifics remained unclear. The intelligence was fragmented. Mentions of a major operation, references to the American base, and coded discussions about coordinated attacks. The colonel had seen similar intelligence before that amounted to nothing, but something felt different this time. The chatter was too frequent, too coordinated. Maria noticed the first unusual sign around 0800 hours. The satellite communication array began experiencing intermittent failures that didn't match any known technical issues. The signal degradation followed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if someone was testing their ability to disrupt communications at specific intervals. Her combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that something was wrong. She immediately began documenting the signal disruptions, but when she tried to report her concerns to Sergeant Rodriguez, he dismissed them as routine equipment problems. The sergeant had a supply inspection to complete and couldn't be bothered with technical issues that seemed to fix themselves. Maria persisted, explaining that the pattern suggested intentional interference, but Rodriguez cut her off with a wave of his hand and told her to just keep the systems running. Meanwhile, in the surrounding hills, Taliban fighters were indeed testing their signal jamming equipment, preparing for an assault that would begin at sunset. They had been observing the base for weeks, noting the patrol schedules, identifying weak points in the perimeter, and planning their approach routes. The communication disruptions were their final systems check before launching what they hoped would be a devastating surprise attack. Maria spent the morning moving between communication stations, trying to trace the source of the interference. Her technical knowledge told her the disruptions were coming from multiple directions, suggesting a coordinated effort by someone with sophisticated equipment. She attempted to implement countermeasures, but the interference patterns kept changing, adapting to her defensive modifications. This wasn't random equipment failure or atmospheric interference. Someone was actively working to isolate the base. By noon, Maria had identified at least 3 separate sources of signal jamming positioned in the hills around Chapman. She plotted their approximate locations on a map and realized they formed a rough triangle around the base, perfectly positioned to cut off all external communications. Her hands trembled slightly as the tactical implications became clear. This was a textbook preparation for a coordinated assault. She tried again to raise her concerns with the chain of command, this time approaching Lieutenant Morrison, the communications officer. Morrison was young and recently assigned to Chapman, more focused on administrative duties than potential threats. He listened politely to Maria's explanation, but seemed more concerned about his upcoming inspection than the contractor's warnings about signal jamming. He promised to look into it, but clearly considered her concerns overblown. The afternoon brought more troubling signs that only Maria seemed to notice. The base's internet connection became increasingly unstable. Cell phone service disappeared entirely, and the backup communication systems began experiencing the same mysterious interference. She watched helplessly as their ability to contact headquarters deteriorated steadily throughout the day. By 1600 hours, Chapman was effectively isolated from the outside world. Maria made a decision that would have surprised everyone who knew her. She quietly began preparing for the possibility of combat. From her personal belongings, she retrieved tactical gear that she had hoped never to use again: night vision equipment, medical supplies, and ammunition for the sidearm she was legally authorized to carry as a contractor in a combat zone. Her military instincts had fully awakened, and she couldn't ignore the mounting evidence of an impending attack. As the sun began to set over the Afghan mountains, Maria positioned herself at the communication center with a clear view of the base perimeter. She had done everything possible to restore their external communications, but the jamming had become so sophisticated that even the emergency radio frequencies were compromised. Chapman was alone, cut off from help, and none of the soldiers seemed to realize the danger they were in. The quiet contractor, who had been invisible to everyone around her, was about to become the most important person on the base. Years of combat experience, Months of observing Chapman's defenses and hours of tracking enemy communications had prepared her for what was coming. As darkness fell, Maria Santos checked her weapon one final time and waited for the storm that her instincts told her was about to break. The first explosion came at 2147 hours, a massive blast that shook the entire base and sent Maria diving for cover behind a concrete barrier. The Taliban had begun their assault with a coordinated mortar attack, raining shells down on Chapman's defensive positions with devastating accuracy. The communications center where Maria had been working took a direct hit, destroying months of her careful maintenance work in seconds and filling the air with smoke and debris. Chaos erupted across the base as soldiers scrambled to respond to an attack they hadn't seen coming. The sophisticated jamming had prevented any advance warning from intelligence sources, and the militants had used the communication blackout to position themselves perfectly around Chapman's perimeter. Machine gun fire began chattering from multiple directions as Taliban fighters advanced under cover of darkness, using night vision equipment and detailed knowledge of the base layout. Maria's combat instincts took over immediately. While other contractors ran for the reinforced bunkers, she moved toward the sound of gunfire, her limp barely slowing her down as adrenaline coursed through her system. She could hear Lieutenant Morrison shouting confused orders over the radio, trying to coordinate a defense without understanding the full scope of the attack. The young officer had never faced a coordinated assault of this magnitude. The base's primary communication tower, Maria's responsibility for the past 8 months, became a focal point of the Taliban assault. Enemy fighters had identified it correctly as a critical target, and they poured concentrated fire at the structure while advancing toward the main compound. Maria realized that if they destroyed the tower completely, Chapman would have no hope of calling for reinforcements or air support. Without hesitation, she sprinted across open ground under heavy fire, reaching the base of the communication tower as Taliban fighters closed to within 50 yards. Her hands worked quickly to activate the emergency backup systems she had installed during her tenure at Chapman, modifications that none of the soldiers knew existed. These weren't standard contractor installations, but improvements she had made using her own resources and expertise. As bullets sparked off the metal structure around her, Maria managed to establish a narrow communication window using a backup frequency that the enemy jamming hadn't accounted for. She grabbed the radio handset and began transmitting in clear, professional military language that would have shocked anyone who heard the quiet contractor speaking. Her voice was calm and precise as she provided Chapman's coordinates and requested immediate air support. The message got through, but the response was devastating. The nearest Apache helicopter was 40 minutes away, and close air support wouldn't arrive for over an hour. Chapman was on its own for the foreseeable future, facing an enemy force that clearly outnumbered the base's defenders and had planned their assault with military precision. The Taliban fighters were advancing systematically, using proper tactical formations and coordinated fire. Maria's radio crackled with confused voices as the base's defenders tried to organize a response. Sergeant Rodriguez was calling for a head count of his personnel, clearly not realizing that his tech lady was currently under fire at the communication tower. Lieutenant Morrison was requesting situation reports from positions that had already been overrun. The command structure was breaking down under the pressure of the surprise assault. From her position at the tower, Maria had a clear view of the entire battle. Her military training allowed her to quickly assess the tactical situation, and what she saw terrified her. The Taliban had positioned sharpshooters on the surrounding hills, established machine gun nests at key choke points, and were advancing in coordinated teams toward the main compound. This wasn't a random attack, but a carefully planned operation designed to overwhelm Chapman's defenses. The base's Marines were fighting bravely, but were clearly caught off guard by the sophistication of the assault. They had expected the usual random mortar attacks or probing raids, not a full-scale coordinated offensive with professional tactics and superior positioning. Many of the defensive positions that looked strong on paper were proving vulnerable to enemies who had studied them for weeks. Maria made a decision that went far beyond her contractor responsibilities. Using her radio, she began coordinating the base's defense, providing real-time intelligence about enemy positions and movements that she could observe from the tower. Her calm, professional voice cut through the chaos as she guided friendly forces toward more defensible positions and warned them about advancing Taliban fighters. the soldiers receiving. Her radio calls didn't recognize the voice, but her information was accurate and potentially life-saving. She directed a squad of Marines away from a position about to be overrun, warned another team about snipers in the eastern hills, and provided targeting information that allowed a machine gun team to break up a Taliban advance. The mysterious voice on the radio was becoming a lifeline for Chapman's confused defenders. But Maria's position at the communication tower was becoming untenable. Taliban fighters had identified her location and were concentrating fire on the structure. Bullets punched through the metal framework around her as she worked frantically to maintain the communication link. She knew she couldn't stay much longer, but abandoning the radio would leave Chapman's defenders blind and uncoordinated. As another mortar round exploded nearby, showering her with concrete fragments, Maria realized that her 8 months as an invisible contractor were about to end in the most dramatic way possible. The quiet woman who fixed computers was about to reveal skills that would shock everyone who had dismissed her as just another civilian employee. A Taliban fighter appeared around the corner of the communication building, his AK-47 raised and ready to finish off whoever had been coordinating the American defense from the radio position. He expected to find a panicked soldier or maybe a wounded Marine calling for help. Instead, he found Maria Santos, and his moment of surprise cost him his life. Her sidearm barked twice in quick succession, and the militant dropped to the ground before he could fire a shot. The sound of her pistol seemed to echo across the battlefield. But Maria had no time to process what she had just done. More Taliban fighters were advancing on her position, and she could hear boots pounding across the gravel as they tried to flank the communication tower. Her civilian contractor status meant nothing now. She was in a fight for her life and the lives of every American on the base. Maria grabbed the fallen fighter's rifle and ammunition, her hands moving with muscle memory from countless hours of weapons training. The AK-47 felt foreign after years of using American weapons, but she quickly checked the magazine and selector switch. As more militants rounded the building, she was ready for them. Her first burst caught 2 fighters in the open, dropping them before they could take cover. The radio crackled with desperate calls for support as Chapman's defenders struggled against the coordinated assault. Machine gun positions were being overrun, and several of the guard towers had gone silent. Maria could see muzzle flashes from multiple directions as Taliban fighters pressed their attack from all sides. The base's outer perimeter had been breached in at least 3 locations. Using her tactical knowledge and elevated position at the tower, Maria began directing the defense with increasing authority. She spotted enemy movements that the ground-level defenders couldn't see, and warned them about flanking attempts and coordinated advances. Her voice on the radio had transformed from helpful contractor to combat leader, issuing orders that the confused Marines began following instinctively. "Third squad, you have 12 fighters moving through the motor pool area," she transmitted, watching enemy shapes moving between vehicles. "They're trying to reach the ammunition bunker. Shift your position 50 meters east and you can catch them in the open." Her tactical assessments were proving accurate, and the Marines were beginning to trust the mysterious voice guiding their movements. But the Taliban had also identified the communication tower as the source of the improved American coordination, and they began concentrating their efforts on eliminating Maria's position. Mortar rounds started falling closer to the tower, and she could see at least 6 fighters maneuvering specifically toward her location. They knew they had to silence the radio operator to break the American defense. Maria made a calculated decision that would have impressed her old drill instructors. Rather than defending the tower to the death, she would use mobility to stay ahead of the enemy, while maintaining communication with Chapman's defenders. She gathered her essential radio equipment and began moving between positions, staying one step ahead of the Taliban fighters hunting her. Her first move took her to the base maintenance shed, where she could observe the Taliban's main axis of advance while remaining hidden from the snipers in the hills. From this new position, she watched horrified as enemy fighters overran the eastern guard tower, killing 2 Marines who had been isolated by the coordinated assault. The attack was succeeding, and Chapman's defenses were crumbling under the professional Taliban offensive. "Command, this is Overwatch," Maria called, using the tactical call sign she had assigned herself. "The eastern perimeter is compromised. You need to fall back to the secondary defensive line immediately." She watched as Sergeant Rodriguez led a group of soldiers in a fighting withdrawal toward more defensible positions, following her guidance without knowing who was providing it. The Taliban fighters searching for her had reached the communication tower and were frustrated to find it empty except for scattered equipment. Maria smiled grimly as she watched them waste precious time searching the area while she coordinated the defense from her new position. Her mobility was keeping her alive and maintaining the communication link that was becoming crucial to Chapman's survival. From the maintenance shed, Maria had a clear view of the base's ammunition storage area, where a team of Taliban fighters was attempting to plant explosive charges. If they succeeded, the resulting explosion would destroy most of Chapman's defensive positions and probably kill dozens of Americans. She keyed her radio with growing urgency. All units priority target in the ammunition storage area. Enemy demolition team preparing charges on the main bunker. They must be stopped immediately. Her transmission galvanized the defenders, and she watched as two fire teams began moving toward the critical target. But they were advancing into a trap. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to ambush anyone approaching the ammunition bunker. Maria realized that her radio warnings wouldn't be enough this time. The Marines moving toward the ammunition storage were walking into a killing field, and only direct action could save them. She checked her captured AK-47 one more time, took a deep breath, and prepared to leave her concealed position. The quiet contractor was about to become a combat soldier again. As she moved toward the ammunition storage area, Maria reflected on how drastically her life had changed in less than 2 hours. This morning, she had been invisible to everyone on the base, just another contractor keeping their equipment running. Now she was coordinating the defense of an entire military installation while fighting for her life against professional enemy soldiers. The transformation was complete. Maria Santos was no longer hiding her capabilities or downplaying her experience. Chapman needed a warrior, and she was ready to give them one. Maria moved through the shadows between buildings like a ghost, using every piece of cover and concealment the base offered. Her limp had disappeared entirely under the influence of adrenaline and training, and she moved with the fluid precision of a combat veteran. The two Marine fire teams were still advancing toward the ammunition bunker, unaware of the Taliban fighters positioned to ambush them in the narrow corridor between storage buildings. She reached the ambush position just as the first Marine appeared around the corner of the supply building. 3 Taliban fighters were crouched behind concrete barriers, their weapons trained on the approaching Americans. Maria's AK-47 spoke first, her burst catching the nearest fighter before he could fire. The other 2 militants spun toward this new threat, giving the Marines the split second they needed to take cover. The firefight was brief but intense. Maria's position allowed her to take the ambushers from their flank while the Marines engaged from the front. Within 30 seconds, all 3 Taliban fighters were down, but the gunfire had alerted other enemy forces to their location. Maria could hear shouting in Pashto as more militants began converging on the ammunition storage area. "Overwatch to Marine teams at the ammunition bunker," she transmitted, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "You have approximately 20 enemy fighters moving to surround your position. The demolition team is still working on the charges. You need to eliminate them and clear the area within 3 minutes." Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came back over the radio, filled with confusion and stress. "Overwatch, who is this? Identify yourself and your position." Maria smiled grimly as she reloaded her weapon. After 8 months of being ignored by the sergeant, he was finally paying attention to her even though he didn't know it. "Rodriguez, this is your guardian angel," she replied, using a slight accent to disguise her voice. "Focus on the mission. Those charges will level half the base if they detonate." She began moving again, flanking around the ammunition storage to get a better view of the demolition team's position. From her new vantage point, Maria could see 4 Taliban fighters working frantically to place explosive charges around the main ammunition bunker. They had sophisticated equipment, military-grade demolitions that suggested they had inside knowledge of the bunker's construction. If those charges detonated, the explosion would destroy Chapman's ability to defend itself and probably collapse the main command building. The Marines were pinned down by heavy fire from the surrounding Taliban fighters, unable to advance on the demolition team. Maria realized that she would have to eliminate the threat herself. She studied the tactical situation carefully, identifying the enemy positions and planning her approach. This would require her to cross 40 yards of open ground under fire from multiple directions. Maria took 3 deep breaths and sprinted from her concealment, moving in a zigzag pattern that made her a difficult target. Bullets sparked off the concrete around her as she dove behind a concrete mixer, landing hard and feeling her old leg injury protest. She ignored the pain and assessed her next move, watching the demolition team continue their deadly work just 20 yards away. The Taliban fighters placing the charges were so focused on their task that they hadn't noticed her flanking movement. Maria lined up her sights on the team leader, a bearded man directing the placement of the main charge. Her shot took him center mass and he fell backward over the explosive device he had been arming. The other 3 demolition experts scattered, but they had lost their technical expert and their coordination. Now the Marines could advance. With the demolition team disrupted and Maria providing covering fire from her flanking position, Rodriguez led his men in a final assault on the ammunition storage area. The remaining Taliban fighters fought desperately, but were caught between 2 fires. Within minutes, the threat to Chapman's ammunition supply was eliminated, but Maria's radio crackled with new disasters. Lieutenant Morrison's panicked voice reported that the main gate had been breached and enemy fighters were advancing toward the command center. The Taliban assault was far from over, and Chapman's defenders were running out of ammunition and options. The mysterious Overwatch had saved the ammunition bunker, but the base was still in mortal danger. From her position near the storage area, Maria could see the tactical situation deteriorating across Chapman. Several buildings were on fire, casting flickering shadows that concealed enemy movements. The Taliban had established machine gun positions inside the base perimeter and were systematically destroying the American defensive positions. The attack was succeeding despite her interventions. Maria made a decision that would have shocked her former commanders. She would abandon her role as hidden coordinator and reveal herself to Chapman's defenders. The base needed direct leadership, and she was the most qualified person available. Her contractor status didn't matter anymore. She was the senior combat veteran on the base, and it was time to act like it. She keyed her radio one final time as the mysterious Overwatch. All Chapman defenders, this is your last transmission from this call sign. I am moving to the command center to coordinate our final defensive effort. Trust the person who takes charge of this operation. They know what they're doing. Maria turned off the radio and began moving toward the command building. As she ran through the smoke and flames consuming Chapman, Maria felt a strange sense of liberation. For 8 months, she had hidden her capabilities and accepted the role of invisible contractor. Tonight had stripped away all pretense and revealed who she really was, a warrior who would fight to her last breath to protect her fellow Americans. The command center was under heavy fire when she arrived, with Taliban fighters advancing from 3 directions. Inside the building, she could hear confused voices as officers tried to coordinate a defense without proper intelligence or communication. Lieutenant Morrison was clearly overwhelmed, and Sergeant Rodriguez was focused on his immediate sector rather than the broader tactical situation. Maria checked her ammunition and prepared to enter the command center. In the next few minutes, everyone at Chapman would learn the truth about their quiet contractor. The woman they had ignored for 8 months was about to take command of their desperate defense. Maria burst through the door of the command center like a force of nature, her AK-47 ready and her eyes scanning for immediate threats. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Lieutenant Morrison hunched over a radio trying to raise headquarters, Sergeant Rodriguez barking orders at confused soldiers, and a handful of Marines taking defensive positions at the windows. Every head turned as the contractor they barely knew entered their sanctuary, carrying an enemy weapon. "What the hell are you doing here?" Rodriguez shouted, his face flushed with stress and confusion. "Contractors are supposed to be in the bunkers." Maria ignored him and moved to the tactical display board, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation reports scattered across the table. The picture was grim. Chapman's outer defenses had collapsed, enemy forces were inside the perimeter, and help was still 30 minutes away. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from his radio with desperate relief. "Maria, thank God someone else is here. We've lost contact with most of our positions, and I don't know what's happening out there." His inexperience was showing, and Maria realized that effective command of Chapman's defense had already shifted to whoever was willing to take it. "I know exactly what's happening out there," Maria replied, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the room stop and stare. "The Taliban have breached our perimeter in 4 locations, established overwatch positions on the surrounding hills, and are conducting a systematic assault designed to overrun this base. They have professional military training and detailed intelligence about our defensive positions. The transformation in Maria's demeanor was startling. Gone was the quiet, limping contractor who fixed their computers. In her place stood a confident combat veteran, speaking with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. She moved to the situation map and began marking enemy positions with swift, precise movements. "Rodriguez, how many effectives do we have left?" she asked, her tone making it clear this was not a request but an order. The sergeant stammered for a moment, clearly struggling with the idea of taking orders from a civilian contractor. But Maria's confidence and obvious expertise were compelling. "Maybe 30 Marines still combat effective," he replied reluctantly. "We've got wounded scattered across the base, and at least 6 confirmed KIA. Ammunition is running low for most positions." Maria nodded grimly and continued updating the tactical display, incorporating information she had gathered during her movement across the base. Lieutenant Morrison watched in amazement as Maria transformed their chaotic command center into an organized tactical operation. She had somehow acquired detailed knowledge of enemy positions and movements that his trained observers had missed. "How do you know all this?" he asked, pointing at her accurate enemy position markers. "Because I've been coordinating your defense for the past hour," Maria replied matter-of-factly. "I was Overwatch." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. Every person in the command center stared at her with new understanding and growing respect. Rodriguez was the first to find his voice. "You were the one on the radio? The one who saved the ammunition bunker?" Maria nodded while continuing to plot defensive positions on the map. "But you're just a contractor. How did you—" His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. "Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Army, 3 combat tours, Bronze Star, Purple Heart," she said without looking up from her work. "I've been fixing your radios for 8 months, but I've been watching your defenses every day. This base has several critical vulnerabilities that the Taliban have exploited perfectly." Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his relief evident. "Staff Sergeant, I'm placing you in tactical command of this defense. You clearly know more about what's happening than anyone else here." Maria looked up from the map and nodded grimly. Command authority had just shifted from a confused lieutenant to a contractor, but no one in the room questioned the decision. "Here's our situation," Maria announced to the assembled defenders. "The Taliban have superior numbers and positioning, but they're following a rigid plan. If we can disrupt their coordination and force them to improvise, we can hold until air support arrives. I've identified 3 critical points where we can break their assault." She pointed to locations on the map where Taliban forces were vulnerable to counterattack. Her analysis was brilliant. She had identified weaknesses in the enemy plan that could be exploited with careful coordination and precise timing. But executing her strategy would require Chapman's remaining defenders to leave their defensive positions and take significant risks. "I need volunteers for 3 separate counterattack teams," Maria continued, her eyes meeting each Marine in the room. "These are high-risk missions, but they're our only chance of disrupting the Taliban assault before they overrun the command center. We'll coordinate the attacks to hit simultaneously, creating maximum confusion in their ranks." The Marines looked at each other uncertainly. Following a contractor into combat went against every regulation and tradition they knew. But Maria's demonstrated competence and detailed knowledge of the tactical situation made her the obvious choice to lead them. One by one, they nodded their agreement. Rodriguez stepped forward first. "I'll take the first team," he said, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging respect. "Where do you need us to hit them?" Maria smiled grimly and began outlining her tactical plan, assigning specific objectives to each team while keeping the overall coordination in her own hands. As the Marines prepared for their counterattacks, Maria felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had spent 8 months as an invisible contractor, but tonight she was exactly what Chapman needed, a combat leader with the experience and determination to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The quiet woman, who had been dismissed and ignored, was about to lead the most important battle of her life, commanding respect through expertise rather than rank. In the next 30 minutes, she would either save forward operating base Chapman or die trying. Maria's counterattack began at precisely 2330 hours with the sound of coordinated explosions as her 3 teams struck Taliban positions simultaneously across Chapman. She had timed the assaults perfectly, using her detailed knowledge of enemy positions to create maximum confusion among the militants who had been methodically advancing on the command center. From her position coordinating the battle, she watched with professional satisfaction as the Taliban's organized assault began to fracture. Sergeant Rodriguez's team hit the machine gun nest that had been preventing movement between the northern buildings, using grenades and concentrated rifle fire to eliminate the position that had pinned down American defenders for over an hour. The second team, led by Corporal Jackson, succeeded in retaking the Eastern Guard Tower, establishing an overwatch position that Maria could use to coordinate further operations. But it was the third team's mission that proved most critical. They had assaulted the Taliban command position in the base motor pool, capturing or killing the militants who had been coordinating the enemy's sophisticated attack. Without their field commanders, the Taliban fighters began operating as independent groups rather than a unified force. Exactly as Maria had predicted, the psychological effect on Chapman's defenders was immediate and dramatic. For the first time since the attack began, American forces were advancing rather than retreating, taking back positions they had been forced to abandon. Maria's voice on the radio provided calm, professional coordination that restored confidence and tactical effectiveness to the scattered Marine units. "Command, this is Eagle 2, came Rodriguez's voice over the radio, using the call sign Maria had assigned his team. "Northern sector is secure. We count 12 enemy KIA and have recovered significant ammunition and equipment." His tone carried new respect. For the contractor who had planned and executed the successful counterattack, Maria smiled grimly as she updated her tactical display. The Taliban assault was collapsing faster than she had dared hope, but she knew the enemy would attempt to regroup and launch a final desperate attack before withdrawing. The most dangerous part of the battle was still ahead, cornered militants fighting with nothing to lose. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been monitoring radio communications from higher headquarters, turned to Maria with excitement. "Apache gunships are 5 minutes out, and a quick reaction force is en route from Bagram. You've bought us the time we needed." Maria nodded but kept her attention focused on the tactical situation, knowing that desperate enemies often fought hardest when escape seemed impossible. Her prediction proved accurate within minutes. The remaining Taliban fighters, realizing their assault had failed and air support was approaching, launched a final suicide attack directly at the command center. They had nothing left to lose and were determined to inflict maximum casualties before the American helicopters arrived to end their operation. "All teams, prepare for final assault on the command center," Maria transmitted, watching enemy fighters emerge from concealment across the base. "They're coming straight at us with everything they have left. This is where we hold the line." She checked her weapon and moved to a defensive position at the command center's main entrance. The final battle was brief but ferocious. Taliban fighters advanced in waves using captured American equipment and desperate courage to press their attack against Chapman's reorganized defenses. But Maria's tactical coordination and the Marines' renewed confidence proved decisive. Each enemy assault was met with coordinated, defensive fire that broke the attacks before they could reach their objectives. Maria found herself in direct combat, again as Taliban fighters breached the command center's outer perimeter. Her AK-47 barked repeatedly as she engaged enemies who had made it within 20 yards of the building. The quiet contractor who had been invisible for 8 months was now the focal point of a life-or-death struggle, fighting with skills that amazed everyone who witnessed them. The distinctive sound of Apache helicopter rotors finally echoed across Chapman as air support arrived to end the Taliban assault. Maria watched through the command center windows as the gunship's thermal sights identified the remaining enemy fighters and eliminated them with precise missile strikes. The siege of Forward Operating Base Chapman was over. In the aftermath of the battle, as medics treated the wounded and Marines secured the perimeter, Maria found herself the center of attention for the first time since arriving at Chapman. Colonel Williams, who had flown in with the Quick Reaction Force, stood before her with an expression of amazement and gratitude. "Staff Sergeant Santos," the colonel said formally, "your actions tonight saved this base and possibly every life on it. Why didn't you tell us about your military background when you arrived here?" Maria looked around at the faces of the Marines who had fought under her command, seeing respect and understanding where once there had been indifference. "Sir, I came here to serve quietly and do my job," she replied. "I never expected to need these skills again." Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by admiration. "Ma'am, you coordinated the best defense I've ever seen. You knew this base better than soldiers who'd been here for years." Lieutenant Morrison, who had learned more about combat leadership in one night than in months of training, shook his head in wonder. "The Taliban had us beaten until you took command." "How did you know exactly what to do?" Maria smiled, finally feeling comfortable revealing the full truth about her months at Chapman. "I spent 8 months watching, learning, and preparing," she explained. "Every day I walked this base, I was seeing it through the eyes of a combat engineer. I knew our vulnerabilities and I knew how to defend against them. I just hoped I'd never have to prove it. The transformation was complete and permanent. Maria Santos would never again be just a contractor fixing radios in the background." Her heroic leadership during the Battle of Chapman had revealed her true capabilities and earned her the respect and recognition she had never sought. The woman they had overlooked had become the savior of Forward Operating Base Chapman. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, Maria stood among the Marines she had led through their darkest hour, no longer invisible but finally seen for who she truly was, a warrior who had answered the call when her brothers and sisters in arms needed her most. The contractor who had turned the tide of battle would be remembered long after the last American soldier left Afghanistan.